Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video on this channel. This time it's about GitOps on AKS with the Flux v2 extension. To understand the next sections a bit better, let's take a look at what we are going to do here. So we have an AKS cluster deployed, and we'll first install the Flux extension on this cluster. The Flux extension installs the open source Flux components, controllers on AKS, and also adds a couple of Microsoft controllers, and we'll see later what they do. Of course, Flux is a GitOps tool, and we're going to retrieve our manifests from a GitHub repository. We'll create some files in that GitHub repository. We'll have an infra folder first, and supposedly this infra folder contains all kinds of infrastructure components that our cluster needs. We pretend here that we need Redis. So we'll install Redis by using a Helm chart. Now we have to first tell Flux where to find the Helm chart. So a Helm repo has to be known. And this first YAML file does exactly that. We'll create that later. The Redis release.yaml then actually instruct Flux to install the Redis chart. We'll do something similar for the apps folder. Supposedly these are my applications I want to install on the cluster. In this case, I want to install my own custom software, which is called Super API. Again, we'll install that by chart. So we need to have a chart repository again, and then a release which uses that repository to install the chart on the cluster. So we will create those files using the Flux CLI, but also Visual Studio Code, and then ensure that these files are all available on that GitHub repo here. Now it's important to know that these files can be any valid YAML for your cluster. So these could be regular deployments, services, ingresses, and so on. It's just in this case that we just use Flux resources here that Flux understands. Now, this doesn't do anything yet. We have to now instruct the Flux controllers on the cluster to install these components. What Microsoft has created is an abstraction on top of Flux, which is called a GitOps configuration. And we'll create this GitOps configuration using the CLI, although you can also create them using the portal. The GitOps configuration, first of all, will point to a source. The source is, of course, our GitHub repo. So we'll use the public URL of that repo to basically tell Flux, hey, this is where you should find all the manifests that we are going to point to. Now, how do we point to those manifests? How do we tell Flux to install manifests? That we do with the second part of a GitOps config. That is what we call a customization. And a customization is indeed, again, a Flux resource, and we'll create two of those, or the GitOps config will create two for us. The first customization is called infra, and we tell that customization that it should go to the infra folder and apply all the YAML it finds actually in that folder. Can be any YAML, as I said, doesn't have to be Flux related resources. You can also even create folders in here and subfolders, and they will all be traversed by default, and all the YAML will be applied. Optionally, you can use the tool Customize there. The Customize tool, you probably heard about that. Customize can be used to be precise in the resources you want to install. We are not going to use that here. We'll just tell Flux, grab all the YAMLs and apply them. Now that's the infra customization, and that would then install the Redis chart for us. The second customization we'll create is an apps customization. And of course, you see where this is going. We will tell this customization to apply the YAML, which is inside the apps folder. What we'll also do is to make this apps customization depend on the infra customization. There's a depends on parameter you can use while you create the GitOps configuration here. Now, that's enough theory. Let's get started creating all of these components. Let's look at AKS first. I've deployed a basic cluster with one node pool and one node. I'm already on the GitOps link and notice that the preview label is gone. It is now generally available. And it seems that this cluster is ready for me to create GitOps configurations. Now, why is this cluster ready? Let's take a look at some of the prerequisites. If you go to my quick guides repo, and the full link is in the description of this video, you'll find there's a Flux v2 on AKS section there. And if you scroll down a bit and you go to the Register AKS Extension Manager, these are some of the prerequisites that you have to do. First of all, you have to ensure that the AKS Extension Manager is registered on your subscription. The Extension Manager allows you to install all sorts of extensions on your cluster, and Flux v2 is just one of those extensions. Also make sure that the Azure CLI is version 2.15 or later. You just run AZ version for this and you'll find what the version number is. You also have to make sure that several providers are registered on your subscription. That's of course the Kubernetes provider, the container service provider, but also the Microsoft Kubernetes configuration provider. And last but not least, you have to ensure that the Azure CLI has a couple of extensions installed as well. There are two extensions which are important. That's the Kubernetes configuration extension that allows us to create GitOps configurations, and the Kubernetes extension, which allows us to install extensions on our cluster. So make sure that you did all this, and then we can proceed to the next section. I'm now in Windows Terminal and I have set two variables, a resource group variable and a cluster variable that holds the name of my resource group and the cluster in my subscription. I'm also logged on with Azure CLI in that subscription. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to list extensions in my cluster. Now be aware there that we have to specify the type of cluster. These extensions also work with Azure Arc enabled clusters. And those are different types of clusters. They are connected clusters. In this case, we're working against AKS, which is of type managed clusters. So if I run this command, I should see that there are no extensions on my cluster yet because I haven't installed any. Now I can create the Flux extension. So we use AZ, Kubernetes extension create. And again, I'm using the same parameters here, my resource group and my cluster name. I'm giving this extension a name. So the name of the extension is Flux. That is something that you choose yourself. That's a name for this instance of the extension. Extensions are of a certain type. And of course, the extension type here is Microsoft.Flux. We again have to specify the type of cluster. So it's a managed cluster for AKS. And I also set an additional option that will auto upgrade the Flux extension for me when there's a new minor version. Yeah, so extensions allow you to have a controlled way of installing software to your cluster, but also have a controlled way of upgrading that software in case new versions are available. Now let's run this command. This will of course take some time for the extension to be created, so we'll wait a moment and then get back to this. The installation of the extension is now finished, and as I can see in the output, which is just JSON, I can see or learn a couple of things from here. For example, I can see that the release namespace is Flux system, so apparently on my cluster components were installed in that namespace. Maybe there is some other information that I can see here. Yeah, I see indeed that the extension, of course, is also an ARM object, so it has an ID as well, so I can find it back in Azure Resource Manager. I can also see that I set the auto upgrade minor version to true in this case. So this is great, the extension is installed. Let's check what it looks like in Kubernetes. I have fired up K9s, it's my favorite tool to look at Kubernetes from the command line, and indeed there is a namespace called Flux system here. When we look inside the namespace and the pods in the namespace, there are 6 pods here. Now, if you are used to working with Flux open source, so without the Microsoft components, then you know the bottom 4 ones. We have the source controller to tell Flux where your sources are, like a Git repo. We have the customized controller to install YAMLs from those sources. We have the Helm controller to install Helm charts, and the notification controller, which among other things, sends updates, for example, to Teams or to Slack. Now, Microsoft has added their own software to this, to the open source components, the Flux config agent and the Flux config controller. Because what you will do is you will create GitOps configurations. GitOps configurations are a Microsoft thing. That's a Microsoft resource or object that you create. And those GitOps configurations then instruct the controller to create, for example, things like sources and customizations and things like that. So basically there's an abstraction that Microsoft created that allow you to control how Flux behaves on your cluster. And these two components here, they work with those abstractions. What the agent also does is it reports back information to the data plane, which is Azure. And in Azure, in the portal, you will be able to see everything that Flux is doing on your cluster. To get started, I just created a random scratch folder and then set a variable called repo for the name of the GitHub repo that I'd like to create. Now I'm going to create a GitHub repo with the GitHub CLI. So of course you have to make sure you install that and also use the auth command to authenticate to your GitHub account, of course. And then with GitHub repo create, we'll create a public repo. We'll also clone it on this machine and then cd into that folder. So let's do that. Let's create that public repo. Let's start Visual Studio Code from within this folder. Let's open this up here and maximize this so we have Visual Studio Code running on our machine. What we're going to also do is we're going to create a folder in here, a folder called infra, and we're also going to create a folder which we call apps, not under infra, but at the same level of infra. Apps. So what we'll do is we'll add some YAML files here to install infrastructure components, and we'll add some YAML files here to install applications. What I'll also do is open this here in the integrated terminal so we can run our commands from here as well, because we need to run some Flux commands. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the YAML files for the infra folder. Remember, we're not actually installing anything yet. We're just creating YAMLs to allow a GitOps configuration on AKS to install everything for us. And let's pretend that part of our infrastructure, we need to install the Redis database. Well, in this case, we're going to first create a Helm repository source because we want to install Redis via a Helm chart. Flux needs to know where to get that Helm chart from, and that's a Helm source. We use the Flux CLI here to create this source as to not have to create this YAML ourselves. Let's give this a try and see what happens. And indeed, this adds this Redis chart to the infra folder, and this is what this custom resource looks like. So a resource of kind Helm repository, and we specify the URL to this Helm repository. By default, the Flux CLI creates resources that live in the namespace Flux system. Now, when we are going to use GitOps configurations with AKS, we'll give the GitOps configuration a separate namespace typically. And I'd like these kinds of sources, so this Helm repository, to also live in that namespace. Now, that namespace doesn't exist yet. It will be created later by the GitOps configuration, but I want to make sure that this is already correct. So I'm going to just run the command again. I could of course also just change the namespace in the YAML file, but just to show that you can add a namespace parameter here, let's just run this, and then my namespace is cluster config. Now the next thing we have to do is we have to now create a Helm release. We have to tell Flux to install the Helm chart for us. So if I paste the command here in, you'll see that in this case, we're now going to create a Helm release. We're going to call the release Redis, and the source is going to be Helm repository Redis. That's the one that we actually have here. The chart we want to install is Redis. We have a namespace, which is going to be cluster config. So I make sure that I already have the correct namespace there. Now the target namespace is going to be Redis. That's where our Redis components will be installed. So there will be a new namespace, and we will create that namespace if it doesn't exist. Let's run this command, and remember, this doesn't do anything. This just creates the necessary YAML for the eventual installation of the Helm chart by Flux on the cluster. It's now time to commit our changes to our remote on GitHub. So let's do that. Let's switch here. Let's add a message to the infra stuff. Let's make sure that we do this, and now we publish the branch here. So this ensures that we have everything up on GitHub. And here's just a quick check to see that the YAML files are indeed in the infra folder up on GitHub. To create a GitOps configuration, one option is to just use the Azure portal and use the user interface. I can just click here on GitOps and then click on Create here or Create over here. That gives you a wizard which will ask you all sorts of questions. By the way, if you haven't installed the Microsoft.Flux extension already, when you create your first GitOps configuration, the extension will automatically be created. Now, we separated that step, so we install the extension first, but that's actually not needed. It will happen automatically. Now, a GitOps configuration is a combination of a source, right? A source is in our case the GitHub repo, and then one or more customizations. And customizations just tell Flux, go to a folder in the source, find all the YAML files there, and apply them to the cluster. To create the Flux configuration, or the GitOps configuration, I should say, we use the AZ Kubernetes configuration Flux create command. Now, this command needs the URL to your GitHub repo, and I retrieve that inside this remote variable over here. Now, the command, of course, needs to know on what cluster you're going to create this GitOps configuration. So we specify the resource group and the cluster name also in variables over here. The GitOps configuration has to have a name. I'm just giving it the name cluster config here. And a GitOps configuration is a collection of all sorts of resources. These resources have to be stored somewhere. I'm using the namespace on the cluster called cluster config. When that namespace does not exist, it will be created. Now, this is a AKS cluster, so again, we use the managed clusters option. In this case, the scope of the configuration is cluster-wide scope. That means that this configuration can deploy stuff throughout your entire cluster. This, of course, is the URL to our remote GitHub repository, and the branch there is master. Now, that's enough to create a source, or to tell the GitOps configuration what the source is. Where do our source files live? Now, we also can add one or more customizations. And remember, a customization is just a way to tell Flux, go to a specific folder in my repository, find all the YAMLs there, and apply them to my cluster. So here we have a customization called infra. You choose the name, of course, that you want it to have. And the path, this is the path or a folder inside my repo. I also turn on pruning, which means if I remove YAML from the repo, it will be removed from the cluster as well. And remember, inside the infra path, we had two resources specific to Flux, a Helm repository and a Helm release, which installs a Helm chart. So this customization, this GitOps configuration, basically should start installing the Redis chart for us. Although I can use commands to check on the status of the GitOps configuration, it's also interesting to see what it looks like in the portal. So the command we ran previously, it finished successfully. It created this configuration for us called cluster config. And we can already see that this one is non-compliant. So we created it, it succeeded, but it's non-compliant. Remember, there's an agent on the cluster, a Microsoft agent that reports back information about what Flux is doing. We can click on this cluster config and then dig a little bit deeper. We see that the compliance state is still pending, and there are 4 configuration objects. Now that's a bit weird because I created only 2 YAML files inside the Git repo. So let's check what these objects are. And as you can see here, yeah, indeed, There are two objects which I both called Redis. There's a Redis Helm repository and a Redis Helm release. These two are coming from my Git repo. The Helm repository is compliant, which means that Flux was able to download information from the repository and also stored necessary artifacts to do the installation. The Helm release is still pending. Yes, we're installing Redis here without parameters. It installs a cluster. It takes some time for these pods to be created on our physical cluster here. So these two are coming from my Git repo. These two were created by the GitOps configuration. The GitOps configuration creates an object called cluster_config, and that's actually a Git repository source. This is a Flux type of resource that tells Flux where to get information from. In this case, from the Git repo. And remember, we use the URL to the Git repo while we created the GitOps configuration. And then we created our customization. The customization basically points to the folder where these two resources are in. So the fact that we created this leads to the eventual installation of the Redis components here. Now I'm just going to refresh to see if it is not compliant yet. It is not yet, so we'll wait a moment and we'll get back when it's finished. The Redis Helm chart uses a stateful set, and it can take quite some time if your cluster node is a bit underpowered for the installation to succeed properly. Helm will only wait so long and it will say, yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't install that Helm chart. If you have that issue, well, I modified here the Redis release YAML. I added a timeout to the install section, and I also set remediation retries equals 3. You just then save this and commit this to your Git repo. To speed things up a bit, you would run flux reconcile source git, and that actually updates or pulls in all the changes in the Git repo, the remote repo called cluster_config here. So then Flux is up to date with the Git changes, and then we reconcile the customization. That means also the customization will try to make sure everything is in order. All my configuration objects are in a compliant state, which also means that indeed Redis is now installed properly. Now let's add our application. This is similar to the infra stuff. We just add this now to an apps folder. I create a source, in this case to install Super API using my own Helm repository for this. Then I create also a values file. We're going to use the values file to override the default values in the Super API chart. So we have a values YAML here, which looks like this. We want to install version 1.0.7 of Super API. Just we override the image tag there. Now we create a Helm release in this case. In the Helm release, we also say I want to specify the values YAML as well. That results in the following. When I run all of these commands, I have a Super API release.yaml, and in the release.yaml, I see here indeed that there's a values in the spec. So the spec of the Helm release is here. There's a values in the spec, and there we see indeed that I set image tag to 1.07. That also means I don't need this file anymore. This was just a temporary file, so I'm going to delete this file permanently from the folder here. If I go back to my changes in Git, I can now say, well, I'm going to commit this. So I'm calling this app. Let's commit this all and then sync the changes. Although the new files are now in the apps folder and these are all on GitHub, there is no customization on the cluster that installs the YAML files here in this apps folder. So what I can do is I can actually update my existing configuration with AZ Kubernetes configuration flux update. I specify the name of the configuration to update, and I just add a new customization. The customization in this case is apps. The path is apps, so we tell Flux to get all these YAML files and apply them. That will of course also trigger Flux to do a Helm chart install for Super API. And in this case, we also say we depend on the infra customization. So infra needs to be healthy, needs to be there before we install the actual application. I can just press enter here and update my configuration, and we'll see what happens when this is finished. I've noticed that when you run these types of upgrades or updates, things might get a little bit weird. For example, I see here my cluster config is now compliant, which is great at first glance. When I click on this, I see I have, 5 objects. That already looks a little bit weird. And I have my 2 customizations. That's correct. So I have my infra customization and my apps customization. That's actually fine. When I go to the configuration objects, I see that I have indeed my cluster config and then my 2 customizations. They are both compliant, but I only see in this case my super API Helm repository and my super API Helm release. My Redis repository and my Redis release is not there. Although it actually is there, but it's just not reported yet to the portal. So you have to give it some time, and after a while the reporting will be fixed and you'll see that there will be more than just these 5 objects. To double check that it is a reporting issue, I ran Flux get Helm releases here in the namespace cluster config. And I can indeed see that both the Redis and the super API Helm release are both ready, and that release reconciliation succeeded. So again, we just have to give the agent on the cluster some time to report back the correct state. That's it for this session. So I hope you understand how the GitOps configuration works together with Flux. If you have questions, of course, do leave them in the comments, and see you some other time. Bye bye.